Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's CITI program webinar. Today's topic is FERPA and online learning in the time of COVID-19 and is presented by Dr. Thomas Gold. Now, let me tell you about today's presenter, Dr. Thomas Gold. Dr. Gold is a researcher and consultant with extensive experience in the United States and globally. He started his career conducting research on political change in Italy as a Fulbright Fellow. For the past 18 years, Dr. Gold has held leadership positions focusing on research, measurement, and evaluation education, local government, and nonprofit institutions. He led the Office for External Research and the Institutional Review Board of the New York City Department of Education. His work has ranged from leading major studies in New York City's public schools to spearheading the thought leadership and research efforts of a leading entrepreneurship nonprofit in the United States. Dr. Gold has written extensively on urban education, entrepreneurship, and European politics. He received his BA from New York University and PhD in political science from the New School University.
So today's presentation, as Margaret said, is about online learning, FERPA, in the age of COVID-19. And there are really four learning objectives that we have here today. First, we want to recall the core components of FERPA and other student data privacy regulations. Second, we want to identify key student data privacy issues that are related to online learning. Three, demonstrate different approaches to digital teaching and learning in a safe and secure way. And four, assess student learning outcomes in a way that ensures student privacy. So first, let's talk a little bit about FERPA. Most of you know FERPA, those of you who are teaching, but some of you maybe haven't thought about it in a long time. Because maybe it hasn't come up recently like it is right now, particularly around teaching at home and the issues around online learning with COVID-19. FERPA is a federal law that applies to any educational institution that receives funds from the U.S. Department of Education. Now, this includes any public K-12 school, primary, secondary school, and most post-secondary institutions. It also includes any kind of state education agency, like a state school district, a local education agency, a local school district as well. And of course, as I said, all public K-12 schools are covered under FERPA. Now, many private and parochial schools are not, because they do not receive federal funds, though it's important to always check this just in case. If a school does receive, if it's private and receives federal funds, then they are covered under FERPA. And private colleges and universities generally do receive federal funding, and that's because of federal financial aid. Of course, there's other funding too that comes from the federal government, but federal financial aid is the primary one that places even private universities under the rule of FERPA. Now, there are core rights when we talk about FERPA that are offered to individuals. First, access. FERPA gives parents and eligible students the right to inspect and review their educational records. What this means is that if you're a parent of someone who is in a K-12 school who is under 18, you have access to that student's record. Same thing goes for a university student, has access to their record. You have the right to a complaint. So if there's something in that record that you do not agree with, then you parent. There's a lot of issues to think about with FERPA, but today we're going to focus really on how FERPA relates to online learning. Now, when I'm talking about online learning in this presentation, we're thinking of a number of things. And in fact, the online learning is a part of what you call digital learning. But the key issues that we're thinking about today are things like remote instruction. And that involves both synchronous and asynchronous instruction. Synchronous instruction is really the real-time live instruction that takes place on a platform, for example, like Zoom, where you're doing a presentation or a lecture to students, or students are also giving presentations in real time. That's synchronous learning. And of course, asynchronous learning is not real time. This might be a recording that students access to online to pick up a lesson. It might also just be instructions to students to do work that's not necessarily in real time with other students or with the instructor. But both of these are part of what we're calling remote instruction, and it's what's taking place right now in homes across the United States and the world. When we think about online learning, there's other things also that might be taking place. These might also be in classroom. These might also be things that are taking place outside of the classroom. These are things like, say, a mock interview. We're talking about this remote instruction, setting up records, recording that lesson. Overall, do students or parents need consent, or do students and parents need to consent to the video conferencing in general? Is this required under FERPA? Now, there's a few things to think about here. First of all, no, FERPA doesn't necessarily require that students or parents, eligible students or parents, need to consent to video conferencing. That's not part of the FERPA rules. And it's okay if someone other than it is also okay if someone other than the student sees the video or participates in the virtual class. That in general, though, the information discussed in a class is not considered an educational record and does not include PII. Now, there are exceptions to this. First of all, if a school requires permission to use video conferencing, and they may send out a notice. Now, vendors may remind users about consent. So I mentioned before that an educational institution may have rules around consent for using video conferencing. And in fact, I use an example here from the company Zoom, which is being used quite a bit these days, that does put out there that a reminder, be sure to obtain parental consent. Please remember that the obligation to obtain consent are required as it pertains to students and their data rests with our educational customers. And Zoom relies on you to obtain consent from parents. So again, this is an example of a vendor that's reminding the educational institution to obtain consent. And again, now we've talked a lot about online learning and use of data. Something else that's come up that is also FERPA related is more around health records, because COVID-19 is a health crisis. One of the things to keep in mind is that there is a health or safety exception to the consent rule that does allow educational institutions to release PII, personally identified information, if there is a danger to the student or others. Now, FERPA does, here's the quote, FERPA permits educational agencies and institutions to disclose without prior consent, so again, the privacy rule, PII from student educational records to appropriate parties in connection with an emergency, if knowledge of that information is necessary to protect the health or safety of a student or other individuals. What's important, a few things to think about here. One is that this exception is used in a number of ways, not just in health situations, but also in safety situations. And the exception allows the educational agency to release that information to appropriate parties. So this doesn't necessarily mean that. So in summary, there's a few steps to ensure privacy. Know the rules. And when I say rules, not just FERPA, but also other federal, state, and local laws. Know the terms of service that your educational institution has entered into with any kind of vendor. Okay. Know, first of all, if they have entered into a terms of service, and if they have, make sure that you know those terms and that you're in compliance with those terms and that those terms are in compliance with FERPA. Know how to use the online tools to block unwanted guests or block distracting or inappropriate gestures on video. This is something that has come up a lot with Zoom bombing. Know that tool. Make sure you can block and someone who's not in the classroom, who's coming in and being disruptive, how you can block that. And finally, go over the ground rules with students in your class around video conferencing procedures and policies. Maybe if you're doing office hours, maybe you don't really want someone else in that room. And you can set your own rule around that. It doesn't have to be a rule that's guided by a privacy rule. Set your own privacy rules that you think are appropriate and that are, of course, are in compliance with these other rules.
We encourage everyone watching this webinar to monitor the CITI program website for additional information about future webinars, available on-demand recordings of past webinars, and our new all-access webinar package.